Hello, most welcome to 1184. Take a stance. Very happy that we can now go into a Heideggerian time. I think we laid the foundation, and very happy that we didn't preemptively try to read something about time and Heidegger. Thank God they're very little on the internet even. You don't find anything in Stanford or Academia EDU or anything like that. But now I'm quite certain we can safely go into it without misunderstanding it as regular time, whatever that is. It's an article by Crutchley, quite extensive, but I start now. Heidegger's view on God as related to time. So ist schnell vergänglich alles Himmlische. These words, written by the German poet Friedrich Hölderlin at the onset of the 19th century, describes a deity that is quick in passing. In the early 20th century, the German philosopher Martin Heidegger shook the foundation of the philosophical world with Sein und Zeit, his magnum opus. Which would bring in question nearly 3,000 years of accepted philosophical thought. In it, Heidegger re-examines the ideas of being, existence, and time. In it, Heidegger re-examines the ideas of being, existence, and time. His view of temporality in specific redefines many accepted notions of time in relationship with humanity, the world, and perhaps most importantly, God. According to Heidegger, philosophy must begin anew with a proper understanding of existence and of time as the possible horizon for any understanding whatsoever of being. The purpose of this paper is to examine Heidegger's view of time as related to God and eternity. This will be accomplished in 3 steps. First, this paper will seek to briefly outline Heidegger's temporalism. It will then explore Heidegger's views of infinity in the divine. The concept of eternity will be particularly important in this section. Lastly, this paper will examine Heidegger's concept of understanding God through Hölderlin's poetic analogy of passing by. The goal of examining these 3 areas is to understand the compatibility or incompatibility of Heideggerian temporality with the traditional understanding. first paragraph, Heidegger's view on time. Dasein. Heidegger's phenomenology is based on the concept of Dasein. He states, being lies in the fact that something is, and its being as it is in reality, in presence at hand, in substance, in validity, in Dasein, in the there is. Dasein, or being there, describes the personal in reality, yet universal in scope, anthropologic inquiry. The question of being is more fundamental to the concept of being than the inquiring person itself, because Dasein seeks to philosophize about itself. Everything must be seen in the light of itself. All questions begin and end with Dasein. In fact, the question is, in some sense, Dasein. Dasein is not, however, an existential predicate object or phenomenological classification. That is to say that Dasein is not merely human description. That person is good or John is tall, but rather a personal presupposition of essentia, because John understands a priori that he is. He is. Because Dasein presupposes itself, the question of existence becomes circular. Heidegger states that Dasein always understands itself in terms of its existence, in terms of a possibility of itself, to be itself or not itself. The question of existence never gets straightened out except through itself. This pre-ontological realization does not require analytic conception of oneself. Rather, Dasein must not merely presuppose the premise of an existential syllogism. Dasein is the premise. As Heidegger says, so far as the existence is the determining character of Dasein, the ontological analytic of this entity always require that existentiality be considered beforehand. The key to this understanding of Dasein and existence is one of unity in form and function. Dasein does not consider itself as a separate entity from its own philosophy. Time and Dasein. Similarly, Heidegger's view on time is completely dependent on the concept of Dasein. Unlike a traditional understanding of time, Heidegger does not see the observation of time independently from the observer. Heidegger states, ever since Aristotle, all discussions on the concept of time have clung in principle to the Aristotelian definition, that is, in taking time as their theme. Time is what is counted, that is to say, it is what is expressed and what we have in view, even if unthematically, when the traveling pointer or the shadow is made present. Sort of one-eyedness. The traditional view holds time linearly as something observed in a string of events. The future becomes the present, and the present becomes the past. It is something humans see, express, and note. Heidegger seeks to overcome this view by relating time directly with Dasein. Humans do not experience time abstractly or separately, which he calls inauthentic temporality, because it is not truly infused with the primordial nature of Dasein. Instead, an authentic temporality is something that constitutes the most extreme possibility of Dasein, and that which principally determines Dasein. In other words, Dasein does not experience time, it is time. Why is authenticity so important to the concept of Dasein? The answer, as with Dasein itself, lies in Heideggerian ontology. Time does not exist without Dasein. It is not observed or experienced as separate from the observer. Heidegger emphatically rejects the notion that time is somehow an external framework in which humans measure and classify occurrences. Time, as with ontology, must be phenomenologically a priori to being. Time is not the abstract container that we imagine clock time to be, but a very basic structure of Dasein's being. Time makes Dasein authentic because it allows Dasein to become possible. The traditional view of time, which Heidegger classifies as inauthentic, theorizes experiences in an abstract, almost ethereal manner. Time is viewed as a tool to be used by a being. Authentic time, on the other hand, moves away from theory toward the praxis of self-understanding. Darshan experienced time as a ready in hand, not as something separate from its use, but a basic and necessary part already predisposed within the being. Time does not categorize or order human events. It is what gives events meaning. Without authentic temporality, events would have no ground, because events must be experienced via Dasein. Originary versus world time. Having established Heidegger's fundamental connection between Dasein and time as being phenomenologically inextricable, the question now becomes, how is time experienced? The answer will have direct application to Heidegger's view of God as passing. Heidegger sees two types of time, ordinary and word time. Ordinary time deals with abstract, sequential occurrences. William Blattner explains, originary temporality will turn out to be a temporal manifold that can be present in any given moment of sequential time. A future, a present, and a past. That are all there, that are all there at, say, 1:30 a.m. 9th November 92. This notion of time is ordinary in the sense of identifying events in a sequential order. Ideas such as past, present and future are all simply classifications of moments realized only in accordance with themselves. A meeting that will be held at, say, 10 a.m. on a Monday morning is not truly a meeting at all. Meeting involve beings. Meetings are not merely made up of beings. A meeting could not exist without beings. To say that something will occur at 10 a.m. on Monday is simply an ambiguous classification of unreal events. The same standard applies to past, as well as future, sequential references. the real human significance of the event has somehow become abstracted. Heidegger refers to this as leveling off, an idea that the true importance of the events have been lifted off from the true locus of ontological import. Sequential time as an abstract naming of events becomes a sequence of nows, moments that flow from future to present to past. In the ordinary mode of experience, these nows appears not as an immediate and concernful involvement with the world, as ready to hand, but rather as constituting an objective flow which is indifferent over against our own projects and concerns. As Heidegger puts it, they appear merely as present at hand, as objects which stands indifferently over against us. These consecutive nows or sequential classifications appear in what Heidegger calls present at hand, as abstract concepts that are used momentarily, yet come and go instantaneously. Ordinary time has no phenomenological connection with Dasein, and according to Heidegger, must therefore be considered inauthentic. Dasein does not experience time in such a manner. Authentic time, time that is inextricably tied ontologically with Dasein, happens in the world. Humans do not experience time in seconds, hours, and so forth. Every event, whether consciously or unconsciously experienced, is experienced in the now. People do not accomplish things as 10 a.m. on Monday morning. They accomplish tasks at the time they are engaged with a set task. The event is only real when it occurs. Nows or world events are part of Dasein's everyday use in a functional and practical manner. The reason Dasein even can use world time events is because they are not abstract ideas or categorizations, but are merely observed, such as 10 a.m. Monday morning. Each moment that occurs and passes is authentic to Dasein because it is being ready at hand or being manipulated. As clearly seen, Heidegger focuses on authentic world time that of which time is constituted. God and eternity, with a basic understanding of Heideggerian temporality, the focus now turns to understanding and applying this temporality to the concepts of God and eternity. In order to understand Heidegger's view on eternity, it must be seen along the backdrop of the classical views. The next step is to compare traditional views on eternity with that of Heideggerian temporality. Traditional views of eternity. The classical understanding of eternity begins with Plato. Concerning Plato's view of eternity, Richard Dale states, Plato had made a distinction between the unchanging and atemporal ideas and the changing and temporal world, thus contrasting two modes of existence and two levels of beings. The time took place within the world and is therefore changing. Linear progressing moment by moment. Atemporal existence, on the other hand, exists at a different level because it is a constant, something stable, non-linear, completely outside of creation and the world. It is immutable while continuing outside the world. Augustine echoed Plato's idea in demonstrating that the idea of eternity is unique, because there is nothing for it to be measured against. Then, in the 6th century, the philosopher Boethius describes the connection between the ideas of God and eternality. He states, the common judgment of all rational creatures holds that God is eternal. A quote from Augustine. Eternity is the whole, perfect and simultaneous possession of endless life. Therefore, whatever is subject to the condition of time, even that which, as Aristotle conceived the world to be, has no beginning and will have no end, in life coextensive with the infinity of time, in such that it cannot rightly be thought of as eternal. Therefore, only that which comprehends and possesses the whole plenitude of endless life together, from which no future thing nor any past thing is absent, can justly be called eternal. End of quote. In other words, there is an ontological separation between the temporal infinite and the eternal. God is eternal not because he continues every moment, but because he is outside of moment. He is both perpetual and immobile, continuous and immutable, simultaneously accessing all phenomena. God is not infinite, continuously progressing on a linear basis, but rather temporally encompassing and simultaneously experiencing every past and future thing. An idea sometimes referred to as eternitas. Medieval philosophers, however, began to view eternality in accordance with the notion of infinity. Something that lacks a beginning or an end. At Richard Dales demonstrates that Boetian notion of simultaneousness is applied to eternity was minimized. And eternity came often to mean infinite temporal extension, the condition Boetius has dubbed perpetual. This idea of eternity has come to be called sempiternitas. God's eternality is based upon this temporal infinity. He lacks beginning and will never cease. Divinity becomes linear temporality with infinite extension in the past and infinite progression in the future. I hope my hands are helping here. This is hard to grasp. I'm just going to move this a bit. Regardless of differences, traditionalists consistently view eternity as separated in some form or another from the world. There is an ontological and temporal distinction between the eternal and the imminent. God, whether atemporal or infinitely multidirectional and perpetual, must be both necessary and sufficient means for eternity. Even time, as well as eternity, cannot be separated in quotient and meaning from God. God is the originator of the eternal forms in which all temporal facts participate. Authenticity and finitude. For Heidegger, the traditional views of God as being eternal, indeed, the very idea of eternality itself, poses at least two particular problems for his phenomenology. As demonstrated earlier in this paper, Heidegger considers authentic time only in the accordance with Darshan. What about eternity? What about God? First, Heidegger sees the concept of death as vital to the understanding of authentic Dasein, because Dasein must consider itself pre-ontologically something that requires existential inquiry. Every facet of temporality must be introspective and grounded individually. In other words, Darshan cannot be seen for anything but its own possibility. As stated earlier, Dasein always itself understands in terms of its existence. Very important. Its understanding is always from its existence. In terms of a possibility of itself, to be itself or not itself. Being itself does not describe every phenomenological facet of Dasein. It must also see the possibility of being not itself. As Heidegger states, death is the possibility of the absolute impossibility of Dasein. Death, or temporally speaking finitude, grounds Dasein in the realization of its own end and limitation. Without limitations, Dasein would have no understanding of itself. Death is Dasein's ultimate possibility, something personal, something existential, something that gives Dasein its authenticity. For Heidegger, the idea of eternality remains ontologically ambiguous and unable to be phenomenologically grounded. It remains inauthentic. If God is eternal, then he can only be seen as inauthentic for the very fact that he cannot see or experience the possibility of not being. If the eternal does not have the possibility of not being, then, at least in Heidegger's temporality, it also does not have the possibility for having authentic existentiality like that of Dasein. For an object to be an object, this is my quote, it needs borders, a start and an ending. It needs frontiers. Otherwise, it cannot be. This is the same for Dasein. Yes, it's very hard to understand. But heck, it is with Heidegger. If the eternal does not have the possibility of not being, then, at least in Heidegger's temporality, it also does not have the possibility for having authentic existentiality like that of Dasein. Secondly, the question of whether or not the concept of eternity is compatible with authentic world time should be raised. How is the eternal understood in accordance with the world of time? Authentic time, as understood by Heidegger, must occur existentially as part of world phenomena. Dasein experienced temporality only as it occurs in the world. world-time is something that is usable, pliable, something that defines the nature of Dasein. Eternality, on the other hand, is not usable. It means nothing in the sense of authenticity. As shown earlier, world-time is the act of Dasein making events present. The Heideggerian now is something that is truly experienced. This true experience of now, it's something that Heidegger refers to as expectancy. He states, to repeat, expectancy, retention, and making present are not merely the way we grasp the then, the formerly, and the now, not merely modes of being conscious of them. They are rather the very origin of the then, the formerly, and the now. Expectancy is not a mode of being conscious of time, but in a primordial and genuine sense is time itself. Expectancy is time. Eternity, and therefore the eternal, cannot make present and practice expectancy. God is therefore outside of authentic time, not in an atemporal implication, but in an existential reality. If God is temporally all-encompassing and infinitely durative, then he cannot exist in the now as Dasein exists. Understanding as such necessitates the conclusion that God cannot experience world-time. Existential versus existential. Does God then exist? Heidegger's answers are not a simple yes or no. Furthermore, if one applies Heideggerian temporality to the metaphysical question of God, how is God experienced or realized? While determining if Heideggerian temporality absolutely necessitates atheism is just outside the scope of this paper. The paradox of God's existence and Heidegger's temporalism is not. Heidegger attempts to answer this dilemma by purporting two forms of existence. Notice the separation between time and eternity when Heidegger states, there is always the possibility that there could be no human beings at all. After all, there was a time when there were no human beings. But strictly speaking, we cannot say there was a time when there were no human beings. At every time there were and are and will be human beings, because time temporalizes itself as only as long as there are human beings. there is no time in which there were no human beings. Not because there are human beings from all eternity and for all eternity, but because time is not eternity, and time always temporalizes itself only at one time as human historical Dasein. There are several important ideas in this statement. First, even though Dasein in the plural sense has the possibility of not existing, it must exist in time. However, human beings have not existed from all eternity and for all eternity. How is this paradox plausible? It is only because time and eternity are two separate concepts. They operate as two separate types of existence, simply because time is not eternity. On one hand, time is personal, authentic, and being in the world, eternity, as well as a traditional understanding of God. On the other is impersonal, ambiguous, and inauthentic. Heidegger labels the former as existential. This form of existence is that which accords with Dasein in the authentic phenomenological, philosophical, and metaphysical sense. This existence can have a possibility of itself, to be itself or not itself. Existential inquiry is not only the primary business of all human philosophy. It is the only way Dasein can authentically understand any phenomena, an important idea when approaching God in Heideggerian terms. The later idea, that of a traditional understanding of eternity and God, is labeled existential. This existence is merely theoretical and even hypothetical. Dasein cannot independently understand this form of existence because it has no ground, no in the world essence to consider. To Heidegger, it is not enough to simply say that God does or does not exist. One must first clarify existence. It is important at this point to remember that Heidegger's phenomenology is based almost entirely upon Dasein. Therefore, as seen earlier, all phenomena must be thought of in a temporal manner. As far as God is concerned, Heidegger states, if God's eternity can be constructed philosophically, then it may be understood only as a mere primordial temporality which is infinite. To Dasein, God's existence must somehow be imported from the existential or purely theoretical to the existential, philosophically substantive. The notion of eternity, if understood in the Boethian sense, is completely impersonal to Dasein. Somehow the eternal and the Boethian sense of God must be separated from a more Dasein-based, authentic understanding of God. Schubert Ogden, following Heidegger's lead, shows the philosophical ramification of separating the ideas of existentiality, very close to existential, and existence, closer to the idea of existential. He states that the object of philosophical theology would not be the divine existence, but in some sense of the word, the divine existentiality, the basic structure of essences that determines the godness of God, even as existentiality in the human case is the ontological structure determining the manness of man. The existentiality of God is only understood in its relationship with Dasein. This understanding of God must, in accordance with Dasein, be based on primordial temporality, God's time being understood in quality or type as opposed to duration or length. An authentic understanding of God must be seen in relation to human temporalism. Ethereal concepts of eternity and all-encompassing temporalism are void of any human significance. Primal temporality, as a structuring divine being, conveys that God is essentially, by inner necessity, relative to finite entities. If, according to Heideggerian temporalism, God's existential or existentiality can only be seen in the light of Dasein's phenomenology, how then does Dasein experience God? God passing by, next paragraph. Thus far, Heidegger's view of time has shown that the traditional sense of an eternal and transcendental God is inconsistent and even incompatible with Dasein's temporality. This dichotomy forces Heidegger to separate theoretical existence from ontic existence, and ethereal eternality from ready-to-hand experience time. Because Dasein is authentic, God can only be truly seen and comprehended authentically. How then is God seen authentically? More specifically, at what point does God move from existential existence to existential? Back to Hölderlin, Heidegger and Hölderlin. Heidegger and Hölderlin. Heidegger's second major work, Beiträge zur Philosophie, an incomplete aphoristic series, reveals Heidegger's reliance upon existential poetry, particularly that of Friedrich Hölderlin, when formulating his views of divine temporality. In one well-known example, the poem Versöhnender der du nimmer geglaubt, Hölderlin states, "That's heavenly fleets on, but not for nothing, for sparingly all times knowing the measures. A God for a moment only will touch the dwellings of man, but none foreseen, and no one knows who it was." What does Hölderlin mean by a God only for a moment? Jeff Prudhomme explains, Hölderlin thought of the eternal on the basis of the experience of the rash and sudden moment of the passing by of God or gods. This momentary passing by has specific purpose, to touch the dwellings of man. Heidegger applies this idea to show that divinity is only recognized as such when it has passed by. He states, the transitoriness of the eternal is not in vain, but the passing by is. The way in that the gods are present. In other words, the connection between the ambiguous eternal and the Dasein objective ready at hand. Being is the act of passing by. How is this understood in accordance with temporality? As previously demonstrated, the traditional notions of sempiternitas, that is, infinite in the sense of continuously perpetual, and the eternitas, a Boethian idea in which there is an ever-present moment or now and constant presence of the presence, share one thing in common. They experience time as the pure passing away of now moments in series. They are existential because the now moments form a continuous flow in which existentiality blasé with our own projects and concerns. As Heidegger puts it, they appear merely as present at hand, vorhanden, as objects which stands indifferently over against us. Thus, seeing time sequentially forces the concept of an eternal God, whether semper, sempiternitas or eternitas, to be null and void, because it lacks connection with Dasein. However, Hölderlin's analogy of God who passes by helps to connect the concept of the divine with the Heideggerian temporality. It spans the seemingly unbridgeable gap between Heidegger's existential and existential, authentic and inauthentic, by showing that a divine being is rightly understood as divine when it has passed by or fleet on and touches the dwellings of men. The temporality of Vergänglichkeit, of Vergänglich. The temporality of Vergänglich. What occurs at the moment of Vergänglich? Can Vergänglich even be considered a moment and therefore temporal? More importantly, how does this actually bridge the existential gap? Heidegger believes that the eternal is not that which continues and lasts forever, but that which can suddenly withdraw itself in any moment, and withdraw itself in order to be able to return in such a way that it may not be commonly recognized as the same. Divine temporality should not be understood by means of temporal transcendence as somehow spanning time, whether temporal or atemporal, but in terms of imminent connectivity. God can only connect imminently with the dwellings of men. Note, Heidegger would understand this to mean Dasein. If he becomes able to contain in the same sense that Dasein is authentic, only when he realizes its own limitations. Heidegger is not saying that God can somehow experience death. But to understand God's temporality as eternal is to negate limitation, and thus existential being. Remember, in Heidegger's reading of Hölderlin's poem, God can only be understood when he has passed by. A true understanding of Vergänglich shows that this connection is not a continuous flow, but a punctual action occurring in the past. Recognition happens only after the event. God's existence cannot be understood in terms of a durative present. Darshan and God phenomenologically connect in an event that must be interpreted through the punctual past. The very concept of event implies past completed action. Without temporal constraints, there would be no event, simply a constant string of nows. Punctuality gives substance, just like the existential and imminent understanding of God provides classification as opposed to an ambiguous eternity. Heidegger uses vergänglich punctually because the punctually present divides those events which now have being from those that do not. In other words, the punctual present divides those events which now have being from those that do not. In other words, the punctual gives being because it existentially grounds. God can only have being in an existential sense when he is grounded by a past or passing by event. Lewis Ford, in commenting on Richard Gale's understanding of present duration, sees the connection between the punctual and being by saying, if, in addition to having being or occurring, events also come into being, then the punctual divider is properly the end of the past, but not necessarily beginning of the future. For Heidegger, the necessary connection between God and Dasein must supply the coming into being, interpreting God's temporality through the lens of punctiliar phenomena allows him to come into being. And there is a quote here from Gale, Richard M. Gale, about the present. The concept of durational present, however, presupposes that of the punctual present, which serves at the end of the past and the beginning of the future, in that every durational use of the present at the same time involves a punctual use which refers to this punctual divider. The S is the phi. Phi-ing at present means that S has been phi-ing from some past time up until the present, in which the present is the punctual present. A candy to be eaten. The connection. The God that passes by, one can suddenly withdraw in itself in any moment and withdraw itself in order to be returned in such a way that it may not be commonly understood. So there is a similarity in this text with what we talked in the earlier lecture 1183, and that is the coming of going of existence. The coming and going is the important. Sticking to just the coming and pushing away the going, as is the philosophy since pre-Socratic time, blocks understanding, makes understanding not part of this world, makes it transcendental. The same goes for time, something that Heidegger so eloquently shows, that if we stick to the present, the now, and sort of use that to make up eternity, like Augustine or Boetius, eternitas and semperternitas, we make everything for handen. It becomes transcendental. God can only show itself or himself in the punctuality of the present, that is, in connection with us, in our life world, in what we are doing, not in the beyond of Tegmark or Hugh Everett. We are infected by these ideas since antiquity, and Heidegger makes a very good job of showing this tendency, how strong it is today. I would say stronger than ever before. It has become the modus operandi of all thinking of eternity. An eternity that has null value. This is also the mirror effect of Rodolphe Gachet. It is an eternity that is unreal, not something for us, unreachable already by its birth. It's like a stillborn child that has been dead in the womb already, never to be part of the world, never destined to be part of the world, not having that as its destiny. Being highly unreal, not appealing to human beings, not being in their lives, and that is being an existential in comparison to existential. Existing, being, hello. Being real, being something for me. So handen, and now you see here, both for handen and so handen are excellent tools in understanding Heidegger, as well as being part of his terminology. And that is a pointer also to, I would say, something that goes for most of Heideggerian philosophy, that the terms are used to understand what he's trying to say, as well as they are explaining something. So they are explicant and explanans, explanandum, explicans and explanandum, the thing that explains, but also what it explains. It's sort of a positive circle. This is also clearly showing the nature of life itself. Life that is something for me will mean something for me. I will learn a concept by using things in the world. Otherwise it will become more and more transcendental. Not something for me, not something I understand. And by still using it and thinking I can use it, I will become more and more inauthentic. The same goes for time. So now I think you see why we needed to start with Dasein, being, and space. And then time can make itself shown. It would not have been accessible directly. Then time would not been able to speak for itself, because this is exactly the point of Heidegger. He wants time to be able to have its own voice, not to be demanded of history, Historia, but Geschichte, the true past. And as Gales explained, there is something of the present that takes its force from the past. Usually we think of past in the Boetian Augustinian way as non-existent, transcendental, gone, not in the Heideggerian notion, very, very far from it. The past is what makes up the now. And Gales explained that in a very short way. I will try to find some bigger article about Gales. Maybe I can do it in this instant. Not good system. Sorry about this. I will end with the last article of the paper, and I will see if I can check up Richard M. Gale. It is very, very interesting. Has the present any duration? And it's a very valid question. I end the article, The Connection. Let's see here if I can do everything from blue away. The connection, the God that passes by, one who can suddenly withdraw itself in any moment and withdraw itself in order to be able to return in such a way that it may not be commonly recognized as the same, is the God that comes into being. This past, temporally punctual event allows God and Dasein to existentially connect. In Heideggerian temporality, passing by is not something of an arbitrary action, but rather the very way in which men can understand God, and which God himself can exist. There you have the Sein. As Richard Polt explains, Heidegger's passing indicates that our relation to the God is an event, an advent, not a fixed structure. Thus, humans must not think about God in terms of an existentially fixed transcendence. something that is theoretical, inauthentic, not relating to Dasein. Humans must persist in an existential being when discovering the divine. Heidegger states, only the great and unrevealed individuals will provide the stillness for the passing of the God, and among themselves for the reticent accord of those who are prepared. The way to accomplish this is to neglect a static God and accept one who accomplishes the event or coming into being by passing. I would say Hölderlin's description of God is the one that really touches. It reaches the goal. It reaches the target. It is like the dart that goes to its 3 times 20, the highest sum you can get in the dartboard. Then it works. Then it's eternity for Dasein. And when it's eternity for Dasein, it is eternity as an existential, a reality. This is very close to quantum mechanics. Previously we saw quantum mechanics as a thing happening only with the observer, collapsing the superposition. But you can also say that the superposition, whatever it is, collapses me and makes the passing and the coming, which is my awareness, my consciousness. So you see, the consciousness is incredibly, inextricably connected to reality. It is not as transcendental as many people who believe in consciousness have it to be. And of course, I would say everyone who doesn't think consciousness exists, Daniel Dennett and Dawkins, they also see it as a transcendental and therefore justly takes it away. As Dawkins take away the God of Eternitas or Semper Eternitas, the God of Augustine, or Duns Scotus, you name it. It is a God that doesn't mean anything for anyone. Let's see if I can find something of Gale here. Just give me a second. Well, I have Richard M. Gale here. It's a tough nut to crack. Richard M. Gale was an American philosopher known for defending the A theory of time against the B theory. Well, hold on here. The A theory implies, for example, that tense predicates are not reducible to tenseless predicates. Gale also argued against the claim that negative truths are reducible to positive ones. He created a new modal version of the cosmological argument for God's existence, which he later refined with Alexander Proust. Let's have a look, see into A theory of time. Well, it's actually quite helpful to understand Heidegger's temporality. And we usually think that we can reduce past, and why not future, to some atemporal sense. And thereby we make time reducible to something else that is atemporal. It sounds like a riddle, but it is not. I think this needs a lecture by itself, but I will try to explain it briefly. That past is most definitely past and not some sort of variety of the present that happened. You see what I mean? The whole point of Gale is looking at the contradictions, and this is also close to Rodolphe Gasquet, that the present is mirroring the past. That is nullification, and that is a reduction in absurdum, I would say. The past is unique. It is not a sort of present that has passed. Also, the present is, of course, unique. So what we try usually, as Boethius and Augustine did, is to reduce time into some sort of timelessness. And that is usually called the present, but we don't call it. It is logocentrism, of course. This is the metaphysics of now, which is not really a now. It's a transcendental now. Thereby, this is the very action of making time unreal and making eternity unreal. And I would say, since Richard M. Gale was a fervent Christian, that tendency will also make God unreal. Depending how much we practice it, it is always connected to how much practice we put into that action, how much we really try to understand time in this unreal, a bit of a forehand and way of seeing time as a nothingness. And it becomes a habit of thinking more and more, and after a while, after years, time becomes an unreal canvas, so to speak. It becomes that temporal linear line that we put events on. And then we all of a sudden start saying, well, the past is just a variety of a now that's past. And we have this arche of time, which is a timeless now. Could also be another objection here. Why would we have the term past when it doesn't have a specific meaning? We could just say, and now that is gone. Oversimplification, well, it's a bit more than that. It's a brute misunderstanding of the whole of reality. I would try to read Galen here, but it defies concentration. There is an opening coming from the famous G.E. Moore. G.E. Moore pointed out that if time is unreal, then there are no temporal facts, nothing is past, present or future, and nothing is earlier or later than anything else. But plainly it is false that there are no temporal facts, for it is a fact that I am presently inscribing this sentence, and that my breakfast yesterday preceded my lunch. Since the conclusion of MacTaggart's argument entails a statement known to be false, it follows by the rule of modus tollens that his conclusion is false. Therefore, his argument contains either a false premise or a non sequitur. And here we have the A answers and the B answer. The B theory answer is the common one, and this is also the one that Heidegger and also, oddly enough, Wittgenstein has pointed out. And you find those people who defend this within mathematical logic, theoretical physics, of course not quantum physics, logical atomist, logical positivist, and rational reconstructivist. And the father of the modern version of the B theory is Bertrand Russell. And we have Braithwaite, Ducasse, Grunenbaum, Quine, Goodman, Smart, and Bradley as followers of that idea. And it's mainly saying that A series, that past is the opposite of future and so on, and that also past and future are reducible to some sort of a temporal thing. And now, if you like, with the big N. And this now is also connected to existences, Seiendes, or being with a small b. And you see time also has its sort of different equivalents of the brute handling space has in ordinary philosophy since the pre-Socratic. Reduce it, make it dependent on other things, make space the opposite of non-space, and so on. You see what I'm getting at? It will be another lecture about this, but this is a breather. Why would past be the opposite of future, and how could we reduce future and past to present that doesn't seem to have any properties, or not be so handled? But more about that next time. Let me just conclude here. What the author of the article is pointing to is, in the same way we make existences unreal and not something for us, we do it with time as well. But time is harder to grasp, because time really needs to come to us naturally. We cannot forcefully grasp it. We can, to some part, forcefully grasp being. It is more durable, it is not as tender, but time is tender, because time also regulates my understanding. I have a timing in my head, and in analytical philosophers, the B series, they pre-grasp time. That's the only way of making time reducible to a sort of non-property, vacuous conception of time. And unreality time comes from that pre-grasping. You don't catch anything if you grasp up too early. Remember what I said about Heidegger. Let the things come to you. The tendency of the B series and these philosophers is not to wait, it's to grasp. And if you grasp, for instance, after a fish in a lake too early, your hand will be empty. And then they use this emptiness to say this is transparent, it applies for everything. It lacks meaning, and therefore we can use that as foundational. This is exactly what they did in mathematics. This is exactly the appella of Hilbert in the Paris conference, who wanted someone to make mathematics transparent, founded on this unreality, this insubstantiality. Please, can anybody here in this conference make mathematics forehand and completely? And Gödel took the banner, he accepted, and he paid the price. So I think we got a good definition here what this archaeis is grasping preemptively, and then you get the sense that you have something universal and general. It is same with the god of Xenophanes. He's rid of all Suhanden. He doesn't have a personality, he doesn't have a will, he's not here. He's an eternal in an eerie, scary, schizophrenic way. It's a trauma that made Xenophanes do that. And whatever the trauma is, I saw on the internet the arrival of the sea people 1172 before Christ, or 1117, something like that, that traumatized all the inhabitants of the Mediterranean basin. It's just a guess. And I don't think it's a good guess because it happened a bit too early. But maybe it took a time before the trauma came in. I think it's not of a good sense to discussing how the trauma came about. I would say it's more pertinent to say, let's us understand its consequences. Let us understand how it works within us, how we become accustomed to eat food that doesn't have any taste, sustenance, and doesn't nurture us. Because this time, the B series of time, doesn't nurture anyone. It's an anorectic autoimmune disease. I sound like Jan Askens. Sorry, Jan. But it is true. It doesn't have anything to it. And the more you grasp, you are like the bulimic, trying to fill the mouth to fill the emptiness. They don't feel taste, they don't feel pleasure, they don't feel satisfaction, nothing. And they add more and more and more. And nothing happens in the end. But I like the idea of the archaea. You grasp into early, your hand will not have anything. So you see why temporality needs to come second in the book, Being and Time. It's already in the title. And thank God we didn't start with time. I had the urge to do that in a somewhat of an ordered fashion. We are being, and then we should have time. Thank God I waited. This was the exact moment, and that is time. It has its exact moments, it has its miracles. This was the time. Not a general, drawn out linear time that doesn't mean anything to me, doesn't speak to me, is nothing for me. But a time that I interact with, that I use, that regulates what I think and do, and does that in an intended manner. Because you see here, the wishing is important. What do I want to have? I wish my future. That is time. It's definitely time. And thereby you gain access to the collapse of the superposition. No doubt I will get back to that later, but this is the acquisition of being able to willfully collapse the superposition more and more, because it's an interactive skill. Remember coping and skill 2-3 lectures before. It is something you learn. You don't grasp for it like this. Catch it, because then your hand is empty. It's like somebody I saw many years ago, grasping a hammer too preemptively, striking it, deadening the nail, destroying it, and also destroying the table he was to nail the nail to. That's preemptive. And why would words be any different? Why would words coming from a Tegmarkian transcendental, otherworldly place? Doesn't make sense. Nobody put any argument why words are unworldly. And if they are unworldly, they don't mean anything. Your words, your talking becomes empty, vacuous. And it's this time Gale and the author of the article and Wittgenstein shows it can only be grasped, it cannot be argumented for. Heidegger doesn't provide an argumentation. He tries to point to something that is in the beginning extremely subtle, flimsy, see-through, almost not graspable, almost not there, almost nothing at all. But then it grows, and you understand this is real time. Thank God, Heidegger. And that is Danken, thankfulness. Because then, firstly, your thinking can mean anything, can have meaning, because your thinking is now coping. It is a skill, it is a development. No understanding is not a development. All understanding is time, temporality. It's the essence of understanding. It is not something on a line like this. Oh, it takes 3 weeks to understand that. It's just absolutely horrid. This is acquiring the B series of Bertrand Russell. This is thinking of time in the Newtonian way, and thereby you blocked out understanding, because then you think you can just grasp the things hanging on the linear time, like washing on a washing line. Just grab your clothes. You would lose them, you will have nothing in your hand, absolutely nothing. What did I say in the previous lecture? Grasping for your own made representations, not being able to delve into the past, not being able to have existence as objects that has stamina, permanence, substance. Everything becomes ghost-like, like a phantom, unreal, not telling anything, not meaning anything, and even more so, not progressing, because no progression in understanding is a good sign, the biggest symptom that there is no understanding going on at all. Understanding is never 1, 0, or done or undone. It's not little boxes you tick in. Yes, I understood. Yes, I understood. I can make the understanding quicker by asking more questions and stressing. Nonsense. Absolute rot. It cannot be more inauthentic than that. That is really the heightening of the whole thing. Well, I say thank you very much. It was very pleasurable. We're happy to return to Richard M. Gale, and we'll look into more how now quantum mechanics can be more understandable. Say thank you very much and have a very pleasant afternoon, which it is now. Yeah, 2 o'clock. Bye bye.